But I'm being pictured. I can't really
Welcome to our panel on lost skills. One of the last panels of the festival. Thanks for everyone for being here. I will introduce our speakers, and as you probably already know, we're going to leave questions for the end. So first we have Laurence Wen-Yu. She is a PhD student studying history of design at the Royal College of Art. Her research centers around the consumption and production of ribbons used in late Chinese women's clothing, as well as how the methodological approach of reconstruction works in the context of Chinese clothing. And today she will present from Qipao to Dajinshan. So Laurence, Thank you.
Let me just make it full size. Or can we not do that?
Yeah. So yes.
It's a bit blurry. It's blurry as well.
Did you click this one the first time?
Yeah. Well, why is it stupid? There should be a present or.
Actually.
Or we can just do it this way if it doesn't work.
I don't know if it's. Just give me 1 second. No, it's not this one.
Or is it this one?
Maybe. Well, I think this is going to make it slightly.
Oh, no, it doesn't. Oh, yeah, it's fine. Yeah. Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laurence Wyld. I'm currently a PhD student in my second year at the Royal College of Art in the Victoria and Albert Museum. Today, I'd like to talk to you about an extension of my master's research from Qipao to Dajinshan, how heritage skills can inform recreative practice. So, first of all, I'd like to share 2 anecdotes from the period that I'm talking about with you. Zhang Ailing was an early 20th century literary giant. In her translation of the classic late Qing courtesan novel, The Sing-Song Girls of Shanghai, she remarks that the best Chinese clothes are tailor-made. Speaking of tailors, Sister Teresa Feng taught Qipao making at my MA Institute, the Furen Catholic University, from the 1980s to the 2000s. She was only able to apprentice from a Qipao tailor in the 1960s because the tailor said that she was a nun. They were not supposed to take on female students. They were only supposed to take on male students. Because she was a nun, he joked that she was beyond sex differentiation, and he taught her. Over the course of about 50 years, women's dress in China underwent very drastic changes. The Dajinshan that I referred to in my title is a kind of a wide-sleeved jacket that fastens on the right. It was the most common type of jacket worn by Han Chinese women in the mid to late Qing dynasty, which is about the 1800s to the 1911. The Han Chinese are the ethnic majority of China, who make up about 90% of the population. Pictured here on the left is a Han woman dressed in a typical Dajinshan jacket and a Ma Mian skirt from about 1870. As the dynasty drew to a close, styles started becoming simpler and narrower, and we can see in the middle picture a Han woman taken in 1911 that the styles are remarkably simpler and they are much closer to the body. By the end of the Qing dynasty, social norms had relaxed a bit, and women were able to wear trousers out and about more often as well. Previous to that, trousers were considered the province of laborers, and respectable women usually wore skirts over their trousers. And soon, in the 1920s, 2 types of clothing started to emerge. The top right, Wenmin Xingzhuang, which is called the new civilized attire, which is what I'm wearing today, actually continues this 1,000-year-old tradition of Han Chinese women wearing separate tops and bottoms instead of a long robe, while the bottom right is what we call the Qipao. The Qipao retains many of the features of the Dajinshan, with one crucial difference. It is worn on its own like a robe with no trousers underneath. Instead, there are only stockings. There are a few different opinions on how the Qipao appeared. One theory is that the women of the New Republic wanted to emulate men's long robes, so they started dressing as such. The second is that they were a continuation of the long robes that Manchu women wore, and the third is that they were influenced by the Western-style dresses. Now, the truth is probably a mix of all three, but the Qipao was here to stay. The object of my reconstruction is a Dajinshan from the latter half of the 19th century, held in the Chinese Chinese Textiles and Clothing Culture Center belonging to the Furen Catholic University, where I did my MA. It was chosen for my reconstruction project because its shape and its dimensions were pretty representative of the era, and it was not completely covered in embroidery, which I did not have the time to learn how to do. Yeah. So here I'll be showing you a few of the similarities between the Dajinshan and the 1930s Qipao, also from the Chinese Textiles and Clothing Culture Center. For this part, we'll have a surprise help from my helper, Claire, who just happens to be wearing a Qipao very similar to the one here. We did not, you can come up, yeah. We did not exactly plan this in advance, but it's so perfect, I couldn't resist showing you. Yeah. So, firstly, you can see both the Dajinshan and the Qipao have overlapping front panels, and close on the right with frog buttons. The frog buttons were popularized in the Qing by the Manchu rulers who were of nomadic descent and thus needed to keep their robes shut when they were riding the horseback and, flapping the wind. The standing collar, however, was a Han Chinese tradition. It dates from the Ming Dynasty, which is about 1300s to 1600s, and and the tall standing collars that closed with metal buttons were very popular in the Ming Dynasty. They continued to be popular with Han women even into the Qing Dynasty. But by the end of the Qing, even the Manchu was starting to adopt the standing collar. Before that, Manchu women's and men's robes, they didn't have standing collars, they just had like a flat neckline. From the picture, you can see that the Dajinshan collar isn't very tall, compared to, which is very typical for the period. However, as the Qipao started to become more popular in the 1920s and 30s, the collar started to rise, such as hers, reaching a peak height of about 7 to 8 centimeters tall during the 30s. Another similarity is in the hem. Women's clothing in the Qing usually had side slits, while men's clothes had side slits and front and back slits so they could go horseback riding. The Qipao kept the side slits, you can see hers, which crept up a bit toward the thigh during the 20th century as social norms regarding the exposure of the body relaxed. Oh, thank you. Yeah. So that's the hem. Since we're here at the Making Historical Dress Festival, I probably don't need to harp on reconstruction as a methodology too much. Please refer to our hosts, Sarah and Serena, who we just had an excellent keynote, as well as Hilary Davidson, on their excellent arguments about the validity of reconstruction as a tool to understand the past. However, I thought I'd highlight a few non-Western scholars doing reconstruction as well. Yu Mantaru is a Taiwanese weaver belonging to the Atayo tribe, which is an indigenous group in Taiwan. She has been involved in the restoration of traditional weaving traditions since the 90s. Since weaving was traditionally passed down within the family from mother to daughter, it's hard to trace and it's hard to collect information from different groups of people. Also, the indigenous people were not allowed to practice their weaving during the Japanese occupation of Taiwan, which is from 1895 to 1945. So that's quite a long period, and many traditions have been forgotten. However, Yuma slowly pieced together information from museum artifacts, photographs, and oral history, and has since been able to recreate over 400 sets of clothing. She insists that recreating complete garments is crucial to keeping the Atayo weaving tradition alive, in contrast to, making pencil cases and scarves to sell as souvenirs. When I attended her weaving workshop in 2020, I was struck by her saying, 人在,物件在,文化就在. As long as the people are still here and the objects are still here, the culture will continue. Another Asian approach to reconstruction of historical dress can be seen at the China National Silk Museum in Hangzhou, which I visited earlier this year on a research trip. One of their core missions is to collect, protect, display, restore, reconstruct, and appraise silks, textiles, and clothing artifacts. The focus of their reconstruction is generally on the technical side, attempting to recreate historical looms and fabric weaves. The left picture is a recreation of a brocade loom from the Han Dynasty, which is about 2,000 years ago. And the right is a Ming Dynasty robe from about 500 years ago, made of a replica silk and constructed like an example in the museum. Displaying it on the mannequin helps visitors to visualize more clearly how the clothing of the Ming looked like on an actual body, since they were usually very, very wide. To inform my reconstruction, I looked at several sources. The first port of call is accent garments. Apart from carefully studying the turquoise Dajinshan to see what kinds of stitches were used to construct it, I also relied on other clues to look for construction techniques. The easiest one to spot is the jianghu starch paste, which is used to stiffen the fabric on hand facings and such. The two examples here both show traces of starch on the reverse. The one on the left is a ribbon, and it's a reverse side in the same picture. You can see that there's white residue. That's probably the starch. And this one is an applique that has come loose, and you can see the signs of like starch adhesive being used. So starch fabric has a very distinct hand to it, which allows us to tell if the fabric is starch even if we can't access the wrong side. The second source was tailoring books, which I found, to my disappointment, were not readily available in this period. Remember how Zhang Ailing said that the best clothes were tailor-made? Tailors generally passed down their skills orally to their male apprentices, and they didn't write things down. Also, they were mostly illiterate. However, home sewing of entire fancy garments were not a huge thing, although women did embroider and sew small objects like shoe uppers and purses. So one such example is an embroidery sampler, which is from an embroidery sampler book. And this shows a pattern for the Yunjian, which is a similar one. It's not the same one, it's a similar one I found in the collection. So this may account for why the embroidery in this period usually looks very similar across different places and different garments. Taking into consideration how similar the Qipao and the Dajinshan is in terms of technique, I turned to a supplementary source, Qipao tailors who are still living now. The first I consulted was in the form of a terrific book series about Qipao making by Sister Teresa Feng, who was born in 1931 in Canton. She learned to make Qipao in 1960s Hong Kong, the one I told you about earlier. The other two Qipao tailors, I had the honor of actually meeting and observing them in action in a Qipao workshop in my master's institution. Both Master Xu and Master Xiao started as apprentices in 1960s Taipei when they were just 15 and 16 years old. Master Xu on the left, I'm wearing a Qipao that he made. He learned from a tailor who had come to Taiwan after World War II from Shanghai. Shanghai was, and still is, the fashion capital of China. And from the 20s to the 40s, it played a leading role in Qipao fashions. So, with no clear tailoring manuals to instruct us, how can we be sure that some techniques have carried over from the Qipao to the Qing? Short question, we can't be 100% sure, but there are some clues. I found some interesting evidence in the form of antique sewing tools from the Qing. On the left is a bronze spreader knife for applying starch, and these are remarkably similar to the ones used today, as we'll see later. Although I should note that starch is used for lots of things, not just garment making. For example, it is also used to frame paintings. It's used to stick paintings on, like the backing. So the tool on the right, however, is less ambiguous. It is a chalk-lined pouch in the shape of a lotus shoe, which is the kind of shoe that women with bound feet in this period wore. Now let's have a look at how these tools fare in action. On the left is another antique starch spreader knife in the shape of a small pointed shovel. On the right is Master Xu using an almost identical metal knife to apply starch paste to the seam allowance of the collar so he can fold it back and have it stick on itself. Next, we have Master Xiao using his chalk line to mark darts straight onto the fabric. His chalk pouch, while a bit less cute than the shoe one, is made the same as the antique. The middle is filled with chalk, and there is a thread that goes through, and when you pull out the thread, you get chalk on the line, and you snap it on the fabric so it makes a straight line. It makes it very quick to mark the lines, and I have been told that ink lines similar to these are still being used by carpenters today. Next is a 水线, which is the water line. Traditionally, a tailor would run a piece of thread through his lips to wet it with saliva and then press it on the fabric. The wet line on the fabrics helps it fold very easily and cleanly. Or you could use a bowl of water if you don't fancy using your saliva. The moisture works particularly well when the fabric is starched, but I've tested it on just normal plain cotton fabric and it works as well. I suspect that the color of the 1860s turquoise Dajinshan, which features strips of black bystring, were all done with the aid of 水线. One of the main techniques on the turquoise Dajinshan that I needed advice on how to do was the 挖云, which just literally means carving up clouds, and it's kind of a cut-out applique technique. Examination of the accent garment showed that the black fabric was starched and the seam allowance turned under. Remembering that the water line made the fabric soft at the fold, I decided to try wetting the starch with a brush. And it worked. Once wet, the fabric could be easily folded over the cardboard template and then ironed dry. Another accent garment here in the red box shows how the wiring is also executed this way, like it's just folded over and then they cut all the curves and everything. A similar technique is called 堆领, which literally means stacked silk. It's also a kind of applique, a patchwork applique, and this was used to decorate the back of the sleeve band. A digital template was drawn up from a photo of the accent garment by my friend Natalie Lam, which I then printed onto cardstock and cut out. The silk satin was starched and wetted in a similar way to the walu. And I just had to peel out the cardboard piece by piece. And there were 120 pieces on each sleeve band. I had to do two. It took so long. Where's my next? Oh, yeah. So here's a quick look at just a fraction of the pieces. They are sewn down one by one with a sewing machine. There are top stitch around the edges. And I did this because the sleeve band on the original was also sewn by machine. In contrast, the rest of the Dajinshan was sewn by hand, which led me to believe that the sleeve band was made separately at a different atelier, at a different factory or whatever than the main body. Okay, so now we are on to almost the final part, the findings. So what are the findings of this project? Talking to the current Qipao tailors who are all well into their 70s taught me that their professional trainings stem from tailors who had fled Shanghai after World War II. They started apprenticeships when they were just young, when they were just 15 or 16, and they worked at large ateliers of about a dozen or so tailors. They generally used the rulers from the region their master were from. So if they were from Shanghai, they would use a Shanghai ruler, and if they were from Hong Kong, they would use a Hong Kong ruler. They are a bit different in size. One inch of one is about 3 centimeters, and the other one is about 2.6, something like that. So there is a significant difference. And they made many of their own tools, such as the chalk line pouches. I've also connected several of their techniques to the ones used in Qing era dressmaking. So the first one is starching, which gives the body to slippery silk satin. It allows for crisp folds when paired with the water lines. The next is the chalk line, which is very quick when you're drawing straight lines and can actually also be used to draw curved lines. You just you have to like freehand it onto the fabric. The tailors do that, but I'm not practiced enough. And the third one is the water line, which breaks down the starch and gives a very crisp fold line. Lastly, centrally to the theme of this conference is the embodied knowledge gained from making. The knowledge of what starched fabric feels like when I made it makes it easier to identify it in an accent garment. Also interesting is that remaking a project like this gives some perspective on how labor-intensive a garment like this would be. Although, of course, since I'm only making it for the first time, I'm definitely much slower than a professional, but it still can give a ballpark of the figure anyway. Just the doing took to me about 150 hours, and I calculated an embroidered sleeve band would probably take about 800 hours just to make, based on the embroidery rates of modern working professional hand embroiderers. So accordingly, the price of an embroidered jacket in the Qing is also more expensive than one of a jacket with Wen-Yu. And from the information that I found, an embroidered jacket could cost from 32 to 40 yuan, and a Wen-Yu jacket would cost about 16 yuan. So that is a price difference there. And watching the tailor's work also reminded me of just how many years of training it takes to become adept at this kind of craft. Not only do the Qipao tailors do things well, they also do it fast. It usually takes them about 1 to 2 days just to make a normal, like modern darted Qipao. This is something that we need to keep in mind when we are doing reconstruction. It would be nice to have the advice of professional craftsmen who have been doing it for longer than we have. So lastly, through recording these techniques and making notes from the Qipao tailors' demonstrations, I hope to preserve the traditional skills for future generations. So this is some of my selected references. And I like to show you the finished reconstruction is here. So this photo shoot was taken like 2 years after I finished it, but we were able to stage it in a way more similar to the old photos from the Qing Dynasty. Yep. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Laurence.
Oh, sorry, I forgot, there's something I wanted to plug. We've got a documentary series of making this set ensemble. It's in the QR code there. So if you're interested, please scan it and go to the museum's YouTube channel. And we've currently got a new series on Chinese clothing through the ages. There's 6 episodes covering 2,000 years of fashion history. And the first 3 are already up. So it's all on the channel. Just if you're interested, I'll be happy to take a look and give me some feedback. Yep, thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Chelsea Newton Mountney. She is an early career fashion historian specializing in home dressmaking, presenting her Sewing the 1960s project at the Stitches That Speak conference here at DMU in 2023. She has also worked with Boo Taylor at Brighton University as a senior research assistant, recontextualizing their dress teaching collection. So, Chelsea, I'm going to pull up your presentation. And
Hello. Cool. So I'm here today to talk to you about this little project Grandma, Mother, Daughter made 3 generations of home dressmaking. So today I'm going to explore 3 generations of home dressmaking through the story of my family and the things that we've made to wear. Our making has parallels with other families, sharing similarities with research undertaken by Prudence Black and Jan Idle. Now, I've really previously hidden away from researching their dressmaking, feeling that it wasn't academically valid to do so. However, after reading Everyday Fashion and its open attitude to contemporary fashion histories, I felt reassured that this could have something to offer. Alongside this, I've become a mum, which has of course altered my positionality as a researcher, which I know we attempt to leave behind. But therefore my drive to uncover women's histories deepens. And this project I view as a bit of a feminist research act. So through oral history and remaking a pair of my mother's homemade trousers, which are no longer in our possession, I pieced together the dressmaking stories of 3 women, including myself, accounting for almost 100 years of craft practice. So witnessed repeatedly in homemade garments and accessories is this huge level of ingenuity employed, both creatively and through thriftiness. And these avenues of home dressmaking run through this study. So this is a bag here that my mum made for herself, and her use of composition, old fabrics and cut-up jeans demonstrate these ideals. I wanted to consider the creative process of dressmaking and have been doing other thinking around clothing as creative practice. So I was really curious to explore my family's homemade clothes with this purpose in mind, contemplating the other expansive activities of dressmaking beyond sewing. So alongside expressing creativity, a motivation for making homemade clothes is budget. And although completely interconnected, for the purpose of this talk, I've kept them as separate themes. And as often is the case, this study, and in particular this talk, has acted as a real starting point. The rich primary source material that's been provided by my family has prompted many further questions, acting as a launch pad for further exploration. And this, as I will discuss, is really the beginning of several other avenues I hope to pursue further. So before I share this research, let me introduce the women in this project. So my grandma was born in 1916. That's her there with her husband, John. She was born in 1916 in Plymouth, and she was adopted as a baby, didn't really speak of her childhood. She attended the RCA and she trained in glass engraving, working in this professionally. She met her husband at the RCA, and he was also an artist. They brought up 3 children in London, and my mother was the middle child and the only girl, and she was born in 1953. My grandma made clothing for her entire family, and everything she wears, everything that's pictured here, she made for herself, and a lot of things my mum's wearing, my grandma made for her as well. So they spent their summer holidays in Lincolnshire, later buying a dilapidated cottage near the Wash in East Lincolnshire. And I learned to sew here, and a lot of the making in this story takes place inside this cottage. My grandparents later retired there, and my mum lived nearby, working as a primary school teacher. She also had a stint as a mature art student, and the art thing you'll see will come back into it this talk. So my mother sewed clothes for us as small children, but took a break from home dressmaking while countryside life, child rearing and work as a writer took over. I continue to sew as an adult in Brighton, as you will see, and my mother, who recently moved to Norfolk, sews, but often now just to mend or adapt a garment. So speaking of mending and adapting garments, I realised that all the dressmaking in my family has been based on adapting old clothes and using old fabrics, often due to budget constraints. And this quote here from my mother, where she speaks about making a shirt from an old tablecloth. What I did was use scraps for facings, like under the collar, back of the cuffs, inside the yokes and things like that, because you just used other fabrics, so it was only the good fabric on show. This quote prompted me to take a closer look at how thrift has completely shaped our dressmaking. And originally, I planned like this really thorough investigation of thrift and fashion and dressmaking in the latter 20th century. However, as often is the way with these research passions, I realised that needs much more space than this talk will allow, and instead I focused on showcasing garments made by my family, which all encompass this thrifty approach. So I inherited this approach of using old alternative fabrics, and this dress pictured here I made for myself from fabric bought from a charity shop, which has been used as a dust sheet for painting and decorating. And here I was trying to emulate a 1970s Laura Ashley dress, which had become very expensive and collectible. So if we use the Cambridge Dictionary definition of thrift, the careful use of money, especially by avoiding waste, we can see how a lot of historical dressmaking falls into its ideals. And looking at these historical examples of varying thrifty approach, there's a silk parachute World War II dress from the Imperial War Museum, and this is a dress from Brighton Teaching Collection, which has been altered 3 times in the course of its life from 1775 to 1830. So as we can see, thrift can take varying forms, but what one maker might consider a thrifty approach might not be shared by another. For example, when I interviewed a home sewist for a previous project, she viewed home dressmaking as a real luxury pursuit, never really having funds for any fabric. So, in my family, we have all saved money by using second-hand materials, fastings and thread, rarely buying fabric new. And demonstrated in these dresses, which are these 2 made by myself, they all use second-hand furnishing fabrics, and there's my grandma pitched in the middle wearing a patchwork waistcoat, which she made for herself. And this piecing together patchwork nature is something which has connected all of our making. So in my family, we have all kept and reused existing garments that have later been turned into something else. And originally this was a money-saving exercise, and for my grandma, a hangover from wartime rationing. However, the saving and reusing of fabrics, particularly by my mother, has now become this kind of active resistance against the capitalist and wasteful production of new materials. So these few jackets here, they really capture the contemporary fashion of their era. And the green one was referencing the Afghan coats that my mother was seeing at Kensington Market in the late 60s and early 70s, but would never have been able to afford. So here I skim through really brief examples of how my family have employed dressmaking to create styles that otherwise are financially unavailable to them. I'm viewing this as a version of thrift. Obviously, this differs so greatly from other experiences where mending and use of very small scrap fabrics are an absolute necessity. I'm feeling like current research on fashion and thrift often seems to chart the second-hand clothing trades and ignores a little bit dressmaking's rich and diverse contribution to thrifty dressing. And this showcase of garments all for my family, all made under budget constraints, is this really small beginning in my thinking about thrift and home dressmaking in the latter 20th century. And these financial constraints placed on our homemade clothes, of course, has influenced our sewing. And what I'd like to show you next is my little foray into exploring my family's creative process behind their dressmaking. So a really nice way to open this little section is this dress here from Worthing Museum. And it shares similarities with my grandma's making because it was also made by a professional artist who designed the screen print and then made it into a dress for herself. And here there's a picture of my grandma. It's a really grainy picture, but she's wearing something that resembles that dress. So when I interviewed my mother about her or my grandma's process behind making a garment, it was really, really hard to grasp the creative process through conversation. But what did emerge was often across all of us the process of seeing clothing or accessories which we wanted to wear but were perhaps unavailable to us due to budget or fit. So here my mother talks about gathering inspiration in Kensington Market. Yeah, that prompted me to make pendants and things that, that sort of stuff was all in Kensington Market. So I'd see it and then I'd want to have a go at making that. So after this, what I'm calling a kind of seeing and dreaming phase, a search for materials often begins by assessing what's in your current collection or the clothes that you own that you might be able to deconstruct. And sometimes a pieced together version emerges from different fabrics, as we've seen earlier with some of my dresses. And a last resort across all the women in my family would be to buy fabric brand new. A pattern would often be adapted, and thread and fastenings would normally already be owned or even removed off a discarded garment. And in the case of this ring pictured here, my mother used recycled cardboard from literally the bin, and then perspex and the bead from her parents' art materials, and only the ring base was purchased. So prompted by this next quote, like that would be my process and I wouldn't sketch it, but then I might look for a pattern or something really similar and then try and adapt it and wait and try and find the right fabric. Through this quote, I ended up thinking about dressmaking as a real creative process in comparison to more traditional art practice. So, unlike traditional art practice, home dressmaking has less of a demonstrable planning process. And often with no documentation of the design, it's a real embodied activity which is really hard to record, taking place in the imagination. And the sewing is also an organic process, with adjustments in design and fit being made throughout, alike with other home sewists, something that Barbara Berman discusses in her work, The Point of the Needle. So also in difference to other creative mediums, the inspiration is often an homage to something which already exists. And this is where dressmaking and other domestic crafts fall short, originality. And although we can see how utterly original home dressmaking can be in the garments that it produces, demonstrated here by these two applique panels from waistcoats, both made by my grandma, ultimately, homemade clothes are often constructed to refer to something that the maker did not design. The instructional element of home dressmaking from either paper patterns or sewing manuals also opposes fine art practice. And this prescriptive part of dressmaking is often really small in comparison to this seeing and dreaming, shopping and sourcing, making and adjusting, which all have multiple variables and is completely open for interpretation. So this part of the making, I feel, this pre-sewing part of the making, is often overlooked in dressmaking research, although broached by Amy Twigger-Holroyd in Folk Fashion. But this became part of my exploration of my remaking. How could I enact the pre-sewing process in the same way I approach the construction? Obviously, I cannot harness someone else's creative process, but I can glimpse at many small parts of it. And as I will now discuss through my remaking, this has opened up further questions on how I might interpret these procedures. So you can see through these images here, one of the waistcoat made for myself and the other one of my grandma in her homemade jacket, that the economical art of patchwork has connected all of our practice. And as my mother said, that, well, patchwork was a trend, and it was great because you didn't have to have a big piece of fabric. You could just use the bits you had. They were just square patches made very simply. So I made the fabric and then I cut the trousers out. So I started the process of remaking by drawing the trousers. I should say that I have seen these trousers once in my life. They were in a vintage shop and my mother swore they were hers and she'd made them because she could name every bit of fabric, like where she got that bit of scrap fabric from. She wouldn't let me buy the trousers. I was like about 14, I think, and she didn't want to buy them, which she now says is one of her biggest regrets. Anyway, I started by drawing the trousers, and why I didn't ask my mum to do the same and draw them, I don't know, but that only occurred to me after I'd finished. So I then selected fabrics to form the patchwork, and I decided that I would only use what I already owned to mirror the challenge set by the originals. And there's family histories contained in these fabrics, as there always are, but like the blue and pink flowery fabric pictured there, that was a pair of drawstring trousers that I made myself and then wore while I was pregnant, which I no longer need, and now they've become part of these crazy trousers. So I made a 20 centimetre square from printer paper and pinned it to the fabrics to cut. And I laid each strip of patches on the floor so I could kind of plan the design so the same prints didn't meet. I didn't use paper backing, choosing to speed up the growth of the patchwork. Despite this, constructing the patchwork was really fiddly and required so much more skill than the traditional view of the craft allows. So as the patchwork grew, I realised how utterly me the patchwork looked. My mum made hers in the early 1970s using scraps of my grandma's, and I've used lots of 1960s and 1970s fabrics. She wouldn't have bought and used contemporary materials. Though also my mother admitted after I'd finished them that she mostly used red and blue fabrics. So one couldn't mistake which of the women in my family has made these trousers, and my choice of fabric should have been so much better considered to match the originals, but these were only thoughts that came to me as I was making them. So here's the paper pattern that I used, which I also already owned. And this part of the making raised that though a paper pattern might be predetermined, as I have demonstrated, the maker's stamp on the finished garment is undeniable due to many micro decisions. And shapes and styles might be prescribed. However, sewing can be so endlessly creative and interpretive, from thread to fabric weight, fastening to length, and pattern adaptation. The options for alteration are limitless. So let's see if I can get this to work. Yay, a little time lapse of me sewing. So this little video, I was really aiming for neatness, which is so elusive to the amateur seamstress. And this notion of neatness is always aimed for, but like I say, it totally fights against the fiddliness of sewing. And these errors that I've pictured here, they give away the utterly homemade nature of this garment, like the puckering on the trouser hem. These are glaring giveaways for the lack of professional hands. So these recordings, in a really small way, have documented the ideas and actions required in the making and production of my mother's patchwork trousers. And although failing in an accurate recreation of her trousers, my approach has mirrored the original. But through making these trousers, I've glimpsed at some of the activity that takes place before the sewing begins, like the process of designing and making the patchwork, and I've pondered a little bit some of the elusive activities which exist within the making of a garment. And in this project, the actual sewing of the trousers was the smallest part of the make. And these little mini discoveries, like my choice in fabrics, giving away my status as a maker, or the multiple options for variation that I haven't yet even considered or captured, or further still, how can I better interpret these findings, has only appeared to me as I've enacted the making process. Hilary Davidson posits that remaking as a methodology can make tangible the intangible. However, in this study, I don't feel like I've achieved that. Although I've produced these trousers, they have failed in being an accurate representation of the originals. And I've documented the process, but I haven't captured its spirit and only raised further questions about dressmaking and about the application and reach of this methodology. So, speaking of capturing spirit and action, there's a little sound clip of me sewing. And the stop-start is me taking out the pins. And although this is an atmospheric form of documentation, I'm at a bit of a loss at what else it might provide me as a researcher, which leads me to my conclusion. And this project and this ephemeral processes reminded me of this quote. It raises certain questions about the different tools that feminists might use to write about those identities and the different places that they might speak from as historians in order to locate renegotiated female subjectivities within historical narratives. So the tools of remaking have allowed glimmers into other procedures beyond sewing, but how to document this successfully seems out of my grasp. And this project was an unusual ask of remaking as a methodology, moving away from academic application towards a creative and interpretive study, looking to understand the creative bonds linking three women dressmakers. And these bonds manifested through a thrifty approach to home dressmaking, which in turn influenced the styles, techniques, and types of garment made. The creative activity involved before the making, the seeing and dreaming, sourcing and shopping, form a large, messy, and revealing practice with many variables, and this still requires so much more thought. The history of this part of my life is contained in these trousers and in these fabrics. And in trying to recreate these historical trousers, I have in fact created an amalgamation of my family's sewing stories, tastes and skills. My family's sewing has morphed together to form a network of garments, shared fabrics, thrifty tips and recycled materials. Past homemade wardrobes inspiring the present through ideas reinterpreted and the historical recreated. Thank you so much. Please play with the trousers at another point if you'd like to. You can see how bad the sewing of them is. And I welcome your questions. If you think of one at a later date, please drop me an email. Thank you.
Thank you, Chelsea. Lastly, we have Helen Wyld. She is Senior Curator of Historic Textiles at National Museum Scotland with a responsibility for European dress and textiles from the medieval period to 1850. Helen is a specialist in the history of European tapestry, and her book, The Art of Tapestry, was published in 2022. She is now focusing on new projects around Scotland's place in the global textile trade. Helen, please welcome.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to be at this conference. This has been a really fantastic 2 days, and seeing and hearing about so much practical creativity has really been inspiring. At the beginning, I want to make two sort of statements. I'm not talking about dress, I'm talking about weaving. And also, this is not a project that I envisaged as a research project. I undertook it purely for fun, and carried it out in my own time. And when I came to write this presentation, I had a sudden sort of sense of imposter syndrome because I realised the lack of sort of scientific basis to what I'd done. So I'm not claiming this is a scientific reproduction, but I did learn things from this experiment, and so I'm going to talk about what I did learn from my experience of doing this whilst acknowledging its shortcomings. So in 2019, National Museum Scotland, where I work as Curator of Textiles, was offered the opportunity to acquire what was then thought to be a unique Scottish textile, a hand-woven coverlet woven with the date 1729, which had been in the possession of the same family in Fife in the east of Scotland since the 18th century, apparently handed down through the female line. This provenance alone made this a priority for acquisition, but the unusual technique of the textile, a double weave, which we'll come to later, made it all the more intriguing. The technique was known to have been used in central Scotland in the 18th century to produce floor coverings known as Scotch carpets, but also coverlets. Our textile had even been published by a respected textile historian in an article on Scotch carpets, suggesting that this could be the earliest known example. The acquisition was to mark the beginning of a research journey that would take me on a genealogical voyage to 18th century Scotland, but also to Scandinavia, Viking trade routes, and Central Asian silks. My presentation today is about a parallel journey which I undertook, initially for purely personal reasons, but which ultimately did inform my understanding of the coverlet. So I decided to read a replica, although not actually a replica, a full replica. So through this process, I've not only been able to verify some of the conclusions that I reached through traditional art historical research, it allowed me to gain unexpected insights into the original social meaning of the textile and the experience of its maker, who was not a Scottish male handloom weaver, but almost certainly a female member of the landowning class in rural Sweden, probably preparing for her marriage. I was drawn to do this experiment initially by a personal fascination with the technique. How could you weave two completely separate layers of cloth and make them interchange from front to reverse and back again on a simple loom with just 4 shafts? I genuinely lay awake at night wondering about this. The context for that was 2020, the world going into lockdown, writing a book in isolation. A particular kind of madness came over many of us at that time. So eventually, as things began to open up in 2022, I contacted a weaver named James Donald, who I had met once. My only previous weaving experience was a weekend with James knitting a scarf. And so I arranged to go do a 10-week course with James and to try and weave a double weave. James would lead me through the process of working out the technique and all of the small but invaluable pieces of knowledge that you only gain from experience. Now, James had never done a picked-up double weave, the particular type of double weave that I was doing. And the reasons for this would become quite clear as my project progressed. So we began by warping the loom, and we used 2 back beams, which you can see on the right because there were 2 layers of cloth, but that's not always necessary. Warping itself is an insane process, as you can see. All of this twisting and wrapping is basically designed to create the shed between the 2 layers, but also to avoid knots or guddles, as they're called in Scotland. James would guide me through an initial experiment, which was a momentous moment for us on the left, weaving 1 square in double weave, through an experiment on the right where I wove a portrait of my hamster, Pierre, who was, Pierre was with me throughout weaving. Sadly, he's now departed. And through solving many of the issues that arose, mainly broken warps, and you can see on the lower left a fix for a broken warp. Finally, over a year later, came the moment of cutting it off the loom with an enormous pair of scissors, sort of ritual process. But really, the most important part of the process I adopted was not the double weave structure, it was the picked up way of creating the design. And I'm going to try and show you a video now, which shows what I did. So this is a very simple loom with only 4 shafts. So initially you have to raise both sheds of one colour, and then you pick up every area of that colour which you want to see in the design, which takes a very long time, about 1.5 minutes for one pass of the weft, but that has to be done twice for each pass because there are 2 layers of cloth. And once you've done that, you will see in a moment, you then lower the 2 yellows and you lift 1 shed of the red, and then you're weaving your red layer underneath part of the yellow, which you've lifted up, but not the other part. And then you do the other thing in reverse. So then you're lifting, so then you do your weaving, and you have to not pull it too tight. And once you've done that, you do the whole thing again. So there we are, weaving the red layer, and then you lift both the red layers, and then you do the whole thing again to pick up every part of the design in red, and then you lift up 1 layer of yellow. So this method is well recorded in the parts in Scandinavia generally. It's a very simple method that allows the creation of any level of complexity of design with a very simple loom. And in the historic vertical looms used to produce coverlets like ours, there was really no way of adding sort of complex design mechanisms. Now, it sounds simple enough, but it was far from simple in practice. It's not only very time-consuming, intense concentration is required to translate the pattern properly, to pick up the right threads, to lift up the right shafts, and to not lift the wrong shed. I did everything wrong repeatedly. And if you, the final textile, the first half here, all of these broken threads are where I made a mistake, because to repair a mistake, you have to do the whole thing again to unravel it. So in the end, I just started breaking them. It was only when I took the loom home at this point that the mistake stopped, because I was not in a studio with other people. So that is a demonstration of how much concentration is required just to not mess it up every single time that you do it. So what did I actually learn from this? Coming to this paper, I was reminded of a warning by Jane Malcolm Davis in a conference that we were at together, where she was discussing reconstructions in knitting. And she warned that without a scientific approach, all we really learn from attempting historical methods is that it's quite difficult and takes quite a long time. And Jane has written, a very good article about historical reconstruction, setting out a proposal of a hierarchy of accuracy and the different sort of scientific methods that you need to bear in mind to do with materials, technique, tools, all of that. So I freely admit that I didn't pay attention to any of this advice when undertaking the project, because it was motivated by curiosity. I used a far smaller loom and far finer threads. My fibres, though of wool, are not hand-spun or hand-dyed. I didn't try and replicate all of the peculiarities of the structure either, including the fact that the yellow layer has twice as many warp threads as the red layer. But I was not attempting to create a replica. This is not a replica, it's a small sort of experiment. My goal was to achieve an understanding of structure and process, and I did achieve this. And despite my non-scientific approach, this focus on process yielded unexpected lessons. The first relates to the important question of where the textile was made. As I mentioned at the beginning, the only published mention of this coverlet is in an article by Vanessa Habib on Scotch carpets. Now, the manufacture of Scotch carpets was specifically encouraged in Scotland by the Board of Trades and Manufactures, a body founded in 1727 to try and stimulate the Scottish economy after the union with England in 1707. Historically, Scotland had specialised in producing the cheapest textiles, which were competitive on an international market because of the low cost of Scottish labour. So the goal of the Board of Manufactures was to stimulate, higher quality manufactures. Scotch carpets gained in popularity and fashionability during the 18th century, and there's examples of quite prestigious uses of this material. No 18th century examples survive, but of the 19th century ones that do survive, this is the largest one, which is on our museum, and there's other smaller examples. From what I learned about Scotch carpets, the idea that our coverlet came from this tradition made little sense. Materially, it was very different, but above all, the design was completely different. What I did find, so this kind of archaic design of repeating bird motifs and floral motifs doesn't appear in any Scottish textiles, and nor do hand-woven objects like this appear anywhere. So it didn't seem a plausible context. What I did discover quite quickly is that a large body of comparable material exists in Scandinavia, in particular in Sweden. So this is just two examples. In Sweden, in the 18th century, this double weave coverlet tradition survived in two areas, Bohuslän and Jämtland. Bohuslän is in the west and Jämtland is further north on the border with Norway. These coverlets are all similar in size to ours. Sometimes they're woven in one piece, sometimes in two lengths which are stitched together. They have very similar designs of these floral motifs and birds and animals, and they often have dates woven into them and often initials as well. So this was a much more plausible context. I further learned that this double weave technique had existed in Sweden since essentially the Viking Age, the sort of medieval period, and a few early examples exist. And in this earlier period, they were produced often by professional weavers. And not only that, these motifs, many of the types of motifs that you find in the 18th century can be traced back to these early examples and ultimately originate in the luxury silks that were imported to Sweden in this period from Byzantium and Central Asia, and which survive in quite large quantities in Swedish archaeological contexts throughout Scandinavia. This is a famous example of the cushion of Canute IV in Odense Cathedral, which survives remarkably intact, and it's a very good comparison to the confronting birds on our coverlet. So far, my belief that the textile was Swedish was based on this essentially art historical research. But through my weaving experiment, I got a deeper understanding of the distance between artisanal production, typified by the picked-up design method used in Sweden, and the early industrialization represented by the Scotch carpet tradition. Before the introduction of jacquard looms in the decades around 1800, Scotch carpets were woven on draw looms. The design was programmed in via a series of cords which would be pulled in order by a drawboy. And you can see along the top here that that's a very large number of cords. Each cord is attached to a selection of the warp threads which are lifted up. So it's a sort of pre-programmed way of creating a design. And this meant that you could produce lengths of repeating designs relatively quickly. And this type of loom actually originates in Han, China, and is very similar to the one that you showed earlier. So in Scotch carpets, the borders were achieved not by changing the pickup, but by weaving separate lengths of border that were cut up and stitched on. So what this kind of loom couldn't really do very easily is to have a design which changed in the length of the cloth. So my experiment confirmed this quite obvious observation that with a pickup stick you can create the different borders at the ends of the cloth. But what it really showed more than that, I think, is the complete unsuitability of the picked-up method to any kind of industrialized production, anything commercial that was being made for sale. And this really made me think of a lesson from Sophie de Rosier, who teaches the complex structures course for the early textile study group. She often uses pre-Columbian textiles that she researches to illustrate complex weave techniques, which are the same structures in the textile that you find in 18th century Leon silk weaving. But she made the point that in pre-Columbian Peru, all of that complexity was created by the weavers on an incredibly simple backstrap loom, whereas in Leon, everything was mechanized, and increasingly in European textile production, everything was mechanized. And this picked-up technique represents a similar survival of a method which it's the weaver that creates the complexity, and the loom is very simple, but obviously it takes longer. So they're two completely different traditions with different sort of outputs and different sets of priorities. I'm just going to have a sip of water. So the slowness, almost the anti-efficiency, is intimately linked to the survival of archaic designs in Swedish textiles. Picked-up double weave survived only in domestic practice in rural parts of Scandinavia, which were in textiles made for use rather than sale. So while these designs retained marketability in the medieval period, by the 18th century, the elites of Stockholm were buying up, fashionable French and Italian silks. The ancient motifs only survived in this non-commercial practice. The second and perhaps more profound lesson of my experience relates to the social context of these textiles production. As noted earlier, the tradition of double weave survived in these remote areas and was practiced by members of the agrarian landowning class. Many of the surviving coverlets have dates and initials in them. They were made to celebrate important family events, often the union of families, the changing hands of a farmstead, but most often they were associated with marriage and were made as part of a dowry, sometimes by a prospective bride or sometimes by female members of the community as a gift. This context made the laborious and time-consuming nature of the technique make sense. Its lack of economic viability was part of its prestige. This form of weaving was literally a labour of love. Sorry, that's a bit cheesy, but by the 18th century, it was the tradition and the non-commercial aspect of this practice that ensured its survival. These textiles represented not just wealth, warmth, or decoration, but tradition, continuity, and social cohesion. Such a coverlet was also valuable as an experience for the maker. My struggle to master the technique and the guidance I received from James and the companionship of the other weavers who I shared a studio with were all valuable experiences. This bound me to the people I encountered, and the process would have bound the 18th century weaver with her community. And this is one of an amazing series of images gathered by Martha Hoffman in her book The Warp-Weighted Loom, where she travelled around parts of Scandinavia seeking remaining practices of warp-weighted looms. Now, my coverlet was not woven on a warp-weighted loom, but Norway is one of the places where you had a parallel tradition very similar to the Swedish tradition, and this is a mother and daughter weaving together. So the association with marriage, I showed this one because we have a series of wise virgins represented in this textile. So it's part of a kind of experience of growing into a certain role in society. Finally, to return to Scotland, one of the clues in the provenance that we were given on the textile was it's been in our family since the 18th century, handed down the female line. And this, we don't know which event or marriage it was made to commemorate, how it ended up in Scotland. What I do know is that there were many different levels of communication and travel and trade between Eastern Scotland and Scandinavia in this period. The Storer family still live and farm on a farm in Nether Urquhart in Fife, which is where they've lived for 200 years. Very similar context to the context in which these textiles were made. So there was obviously, I think, some woman, possibly Swedish, who married possibly a Scottish trader or something like that, and that there's a story like that which remains to be uncovered. So my next steps are to continue that level of research, but also I've learned that there is one woman in Sweden still practicing picked up double weave on horizontal loom. I need to make contact with her. So the experience has kind of opened up both new avenues for historical research, but also for connections with people still practicing this technique.
Thank you so much. So actually, if I can ask you to stay here and the other two speakers who join me in the front for our discussion or questions. Does anyone have any questions for them?
This is for Helen. Is there a material advantage as well to having this kind of double surface? Is there greater insulation and then warmth? Is this kind of a warmer thing as well? Are there material values that increase its overall social value too?
Yeah, no, I'm sure the double weave technique makes it doubly warm, but I think it's also something to do with the isolation of Sweden in this period. So the motifs, the repeating motifs, that comes from a draw loom, because to tie up a pattern makes sense to have it repeat in the length and in the width of the cloth. It doesn't make any sense in a picked up double weave. So I think the double weave technique may be a way of creating a design in a very strong way without having a draw loom, without being able. So I think it's partly a response to that. It's a very simple way of producing the design. Obviously, in Scandinavian, it makes it warmer as well. So yeah, I'm sure it has a higher material value with the amount of materials used. So yeah, that's definitely a factor. But it's also a sort of charmingly naive way of reproducing something without having the tools that the original was made with.
I really enjoyed all three of your presentations, so thank you so much. I have a question for Chelsea. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to the different materials that were used over the 3 generations and how access to materials changed. And I was also sort of wondering how this project was received by your family.
Yeah, cool. So I think I said my grandma was a professional artist, but amateur sewer. So she was buying fabrics from, occasionally they buy them from department stores in London, or they would generally go to jumble sales. My mum talked lots in kind of oral history interviews about going to jumble sales and buying clothes and disassembling them, hence why they had like a really good scrap collection. And then me and my mother kind of inherited this, or would use this same big collection that my grandma had amassed. And then when she passed away, it kind of came to my mum, and then it kind of came to me as well. So my grandma's collection, I guess, we've all shared. And I think similar to what I said, that inherited thing of this approach of reusing old things, reusing old fabrics. And then how is it received? My mum's memory is not quite as great as it once was, so that's part of the reason that I really wanted to do it now. She understands that I'm obsessed with clothes and obsessed with home dressmaking histories, so she's like, yes, of course you are. But she appreciates its merits as a kind of feminist women's history thing, but I think otherwise is kind of like, what are you doing? But yeah, she's happy about it in a way that she's like, as long as I don't have to be in any way like pictured in it or anything like that. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else? Do you have any? Okay.
I have a question for Laurence. Do you have any plans to do any more recreation?
A bit. I do want to make another set of the late Qing because the set is with the museum. Like, it's not mine. I want to make a red set so it can be loaned out to people for bridal shoots. Like, there's an increasing trend of Chinese young people wanting to wear like traditional clothing when they get their wedding shoots. So I think that would be a good good thing to do, good thing to have. Yeah.
This is actually making me think of also a question that I had for you, because I think Helen and Chelsea specifically talked about the fun of it. So like doing this for fun in a way. I don't know how that plays into your own research, but I was thinking about that because it starts, or it can start as a fun project, but then it can become research and it can inform research in very deep ways, I think. So I was wondering if you could maybe expand a little bit on that, or how you think that fun can inform research and vice versa, and what we can also learn from that in a way, I think also maybe of reclaiming history probably.
Yeah, sure. It's fun for the first 10 hours. No, not just kidding. The project started because when I started my MA, I wasn't sure that I wanted to do historical dress as a study because I wasn't aware that this existed. But then my supervisor there, she saw that I liked making my own clothes, and she said that we can get the funding for you to do a summer project. It was supposed to be a summer project at first, to do a summer project and where you choose something from a museum and recreate it. And then it ended up taking more than the summer, so it rolled into it, became my master's thesis. It was supposed to be just a summer project, but it was fun, and I love that I got to work with other people. So before that, I had just been, making things myself, like looking at YouTube for tutorials. And during the course of this project, I got to work with my classmates. I got to work with the Qipao tailors, and it's always much less, much less painful when you have someone else to discuss things with. Such as like we are doing the doing for hundreds and hundreds of hours, and at some point I had two of my friends who were just all cutting the pieces together while complaining about our studies, whatever. That was fun. That was fun. Yeah. So the general experience was positive, but it does get a bit tiresome after a while because it's very fiddly and it's a bit repetitive. Yeah. But it wouldn't put me off trying to make one again. Although I'm not sure if I have another spare 3 months before I finish my PhD. So. No, who knows?
Chelsea, Helen, do you have thoughts?
Well, I think it's a thread that has been there in all of the papers that I've heard in this conference, but it's not always acknowledged. It's mostly been questioned at the end, like, what did it feel like? So I think it's important to acknowledge it because this is slightly unusual in academic research, that we're all here, and many of us probably came to our subjects partly because of an enjoyment of it. I think it's more true in dress history than other fields, and it's something that I'm very curious about. I'd like to understand what it means about academic practice, even without this practical element, because it's something that's not there in all fields. So it's very personal, I think, for a lot of us, which is interesting.
Yeah, totally. What you said about that personal thing and the enjoyment being like a way in. And how to make that academically valid or interesting to others is something I've questioned throughout this. And all those ephemeral, intangible processes and the feeling that we are trying to like capture and then display for everyone else, I still haven't grasped properly. But yeah, I'm enjoying the learning.
Speaking of drinking.
Yes, it's not a question as such, but I think I just wanted to encourage you that I responded very quickly to what you were saying because of the personal nature of it, and because of I have zero academic background. I don't understand half the words that have been said in the conference, but I just immediately was like, oh yes, this is just so familiar, and so it is valid and it is important, and I don't know how you tie it in with academics, but it works on a personal level.
Really kind of you to say. I think it's that thing of uncovering histories that are less discussed, and home dressmaking isn't that widely academically researched. I'm really new to academia, so that for me is something I'm trying to chase a bit, I guess, is to make it valid in that way. But also I think, like I said at the beginning, can it be like a feminist research tool to do it in this different way that isn't so academic? Yeah. I'm pondering that. Thank you.
This is a bit of a weird technical question and maybe not very, I don't know how interesting it is, but I'm curious about how much starch is used in the manufacture of these garments.
The ratio of starch and water. I cook the starch myself, but
I mean, how it conserving them.
Oh yeah, it's bad for conservation. But the modern ones, they put some potassium alum, like some potassium something powder in to act as a. I put it as well to act as a preservative. And I'm not sure what the antique ones were, but I didn't actually see a lot of moth damage there because Chinese people are really big about keeping their stuff in camphor chests and using mothballs. And Taiwan was a huge producer of camphor all throughout the 18th, 19th century. So I think it may be due to that, because I would have thought to see more insect damage than just the silk shattering on its own. Yeah.
Because I thought it would did the starch itself degrade and deteriorate?
It does degrade. If you wear it more, it becomes softer. But I think the purpose of the starch is to help during the dressmaking process. You can wash it off later if you really want. I don't think they usually wouldn't wash silks because the silks were not very color fast. And there are some extant garments where you can see the color bleeding when there's such as on the doily and patchwork, there's some color bleeding when it got wet. Yeah, so they wouldn't have laundered the silks.
Thank you.
Thank you, all of you guys, again, echoing what everyone else has said for three really wonderful talks, and sort of building off of this sort of general question about sort of the purpose of all of this and the personal and the emotion. I was really struck there's this sort of common theme in all of your talks about preservation and sort of passing down and sort of imbuing these objects and what you're creating and reconstructing with yourself, and then in addition to then these ideas and techniques being passed down. And I was just wondering if that was something that struck you all, I guess, in the process of going through these recreations and reconstructions, or whether it was sort of something that the emotional resonance and potential impact long term sort of hit you and sort of after the fact, I guess, the emotional embodiment as you were going through the process.
Something that I really wanted to look at but didn't get to in time for this talk was how did we share those skills? How literally did we share them with each other? But I didn't have enough time for this, but hopefully I can do that in the future. But what you were saying about it being emotional, for sure, and I'm saying about feminist research tools, but really passionate about uncovering these bits of women's lives that are so disregarded and seen as unskilled and unimportant, or not really art, or not really whatever. I'm really determined to kind of try and show that they are, in my eyes. Yeah. Thank you.
I think what I learned, which I wouldn't have realised, is looking closely at an object and trying to reproduce it. You learn how many details of the creation are the result of tiny refinements that could only happen with generations of the skill being passed down, and every generation adding a very small thing and refining a tiny thing in a tiny way. It's incredibly subtle, and that's why it's such a beautiful, perfect object, because of care from many, many generations. And I think, yeah, looking in that way, I think is the only way that you can really understand that.
It was something that really struck me only when I was talking with the Qipao tailors, because they were saying that they don't want their sons to continue in this trade because less and less people are getting Qipao's tailor-made, less and less people are getting anything tailor-made, and they said they're like young people are not very happy to spend like 1 to 2 years as an apprentice anymore. So he's doing this kind of workshops to keep things alive. And when the Qipao masters came to our workshop, we had like 2 months where we had them make 10 different Qipao from 10 decades, and we filmed the whole process. So at least it will be preserved in some way, although it's very unlikely that we will have this kind of apprentice anymore. Like I talked to another Qipao tailor who specialized in the buttons, the Qipao frock buttons, and she said that for the first few months of her apprenticeship, she was literally just cutting strips of newspaper in like perfect, like 5/8 of an inch. And that was like what she did for like 2 months straight. I don't think anyone now is going to do that. We have like rulers and stuff, so we can preserve a lot of the things, while we can preserve everything. Yeah, it's a shame.
This is just a curious question. On your presentation, Laurence, you had 4 characters on the corner of each. What do you have?
It says 以古为镜, which means using the past as a mirror, and it's the same from, I forgot which one it was. It was from an ancient text. I forgot if it's Confucius or Han or something like that. And it's just like 以古为镜可以知天下. It basically just said when like you can use the past as a mirror and you can see what happens in the future. Yeah. And I just wanted it to like decorate the corners and have a little bit of tie-in to my presentation. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, we still have technically a little bit under 10 minutes, but I wanted to give you time to come and see the pieces if you want before we go for afternoon tea. And then the other thing is that in room 235, so down the corridor, Sarah is wearing a mantua that they've made this week. So if you want to go and see it, you can also head over there before afternoon tea. Thank you, everyone, and please join me in thanking our speakers for a fantastic panel today.
That helps.
It looks like a really good creature with a mouth here and a nose here and 2 eyes and 2 legs.
I think it's literally
Elements like that. You see that how last job.
It's a kind of tree of life.
You can see all my hairs.
It reminds me a bit of the knitting that Scandinavian structures have.
That's probably the motif.
Yeah, they have motifs like this. I think that actually is pretty good this.
Well, even doing other things.
Yeah.
Easier than expected. I mean,
I've only done like reading workshop. It was sad. I couldn't stand it. Like, yeah. And I didn't like counting. I don't like counting. So.
pick up those.
And most of these are
Those
from
change
large areas as well.
like I know what happens.
You see a case on the table, and they don't have any.
Maybe there was a little bit
which was a replica of the, I believe it's a Dajinshan West as well. And she had like, it took her 10 years to complete
I was saying, I made it.
I have no idea. Because my own detested that.
When I did it, they
have no idea.
were like
She
so
hated it so much. But I was like,
I was like, I'm going to normal for something to be like.
no, I mean my
extra.
I think my mum picked it.
And my mum,
But
my mum
Like I'm not just like and there's also some really embroidery.
Also, I think the fabric, like that is going to make it stick out.
for sure. And like all the things that I
Yeah, I just wanted to recently because this is a podcast and it's not as concentration intensive. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, you
No,
did
that's what you did as well.
Yeah, you did like an iron to the side.
was really hoping that I wouldn't
Your garment
do
fully hand
any patchwork, especially those lace patchwork.
I actually machined the seams where you can see, but it's mostly hand stitch.
Something else.
But I only machine like the straight one in the front and the back and under the sleeves.
And did you have
No, I was saying I tried one maybe put me but on my eye.
Yeah, I did have practice. I've done another about 1911-ish Chinese garment before this. And I've done lots of historical garments that require lots of hand stitching. I did a whole smocked shirt waist and dress. I think it was from
trousers.
yeah, and that took also very long. But that was also during COVID, so I had to think about it. Yeah. So I think like hand stitching translates across different types. I think you gotta keep attention. It's not too hard for bears. But I really hate the property numbers. They are so much materials. You can put yourself because the fabric is starch, so it's very hard to poke through. Yeah, not really, but you need a thimble or I use pliers. I tried, and sometimes a thinner needle works better because a thinner needle encounters less resistance. Yeah, I tried both the thicker and thinner one. Yeah, but it's just a bit sharp.
And so where is your PhD?
Is that Royal College of Art?
Okay, so you're here for now.
Yeah, I'm here for this 3 years. Yeah, 3 to 4 years.
She's never been able to get it's very inspiring.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to coming to the V&A because they have a very good collection. But it's currently being moved to their new V&A East.
You should come to Edinburgh. You have a good
I was in Edinburgh last December for Christmas. And I went to the museum. I don't think I went to the museum.
We have a couple of things on display. We loaned jackets to the Forgotten Practice.
Oh, yeah, I did see that.
You might
That's what
Oh, yeah, there were 2 different ones, yeah.
very welcome.
Oh, I love to.
Yes, exactly. So room 235. So I think it's right after the door.
I haven't looked yet. The collection's online at all.
There's a database online that it's not very good and there's not very good photos, but there are descriptions.
Yeah, I have a look. I'll shoot you an email. Yeah, I'm planning to go up to Macclesfield in Manchester because there's a Suk Museum up there at some point in this year.
I was there last year. That's where I did the early textile study group course, which they had in Macclesfield. At that point, the barn with all the looms was being renovated, so it wasn't open. So I don't know if it's open again, but the museum is amazing, and they have some very old men who know how the looms work.
Yeah, I'm actually doing Suk ribbons for a PhD because the ribbons they come from the UK. They were very popular here during the 19th century, and they exported those to China. And then China started copying the ribbons. And I use it everywhere. Like I've got it here, but it's not correct here, which is why I didn't put it here. This is a replica that a reader in the UK made for me. It's papillionaceous. I think it's based on home, and the pattern is taken from like an antique garment.
So this in Macclesfield, well, you'll know they made a lot of this type.
I'm hoping to go to Macclesfield because I think they have some ribbons. And I've been to Coventry because Coventry also used to be a huge center of ribbons until I think 1860 or something.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, lots of leads to follow up on.
Yes, and then things move back and forth because I don't know. There's often an assumption that it was all influenced, like the West copying.
Yeah, but I think things are going like back and forth. That's what I've learned. That's what I'm really curious to know.
It's not one way.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask what yarn it is.
It's a yarn that James uses a
Yeah.
lot.
Okay.
I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
Find out from you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just.
It's quite easily available, and it's what he uses for his. He makes
I think I follow you on Instagram. I love your reels.
When I read,
It looks
actually when I read your
and
name
feels.
before the conference,
It doesn't feel
I was
as.
like, I know her
as
from
greasy.
Instagram. But I don't think I got the chance to.
Yeah. I mean, it does.
I think Faith mentioned that she knew Faith Cooper.
Maybe did she went to your university?
Yeah,
Did you study together or?
I'm a new thing.
I thought you were overlap. I was there early for her.
No.
I think she said she saw our videos.
As somebody who
that was very special.
rushes in headlong
Yeah, she was here on the Fulbright
to plans, and
she was also on I think Chinese
I mean,
program.
you usually see it in when I take something apart.
Yeah, and she helped me
because I
edit
have
all
to
our
fix
videos.
it.
Not the one here, but the later
Usually
one.
something mechanical,
Like she helped me
but
edit them. And
yeah, like
I have a referring
Nice.
I think she's hoping to do a PhD as well, but she hasn't had a lot of luck.
Yeah,
I don't know what to do next.
to be honest,
that's
very
super.
you're
Actually, I haven't.
No, I'm
found
RCA.
it yet.
RCA, yeah.
You would think that
Well, I
might,
think
but
she's considering that
my
one, but I guess
dad's
the
a
problem
doctor
is,
and my
well,
mom's
first
a
of
nurse,
all,
so maybe
funding and then
I've
also
got
a
security in that
supervisor.
sense. But yeah, no, I've
And I don't know if
I'll
this was the
start
case
like
where you guys
unscrewing
for us who
things
don't do the
and blah blah
European
blah
fashion
to
history.
fix something.
Opportunities are fewer because they're
And then
less
I'll be like,
focused
how
on doing that.
did I take photos beforehand? No, of course not. I just started doing.
So I was looking at this and the
I was surprised that we found out that I have ADHD.
Yeah. I think I told Faith about Sarah Jones, but Faith wants to do, I think, 20th century.
Yeah, she was like 20. And she was doing that from me.
Yeah, so
Observing myself.
it's difficult to find someone. I also told her, like, I would love for you to come to me and you, but honestly, I mean, I would be open to supervising you, but I know I'm far from the person
Well, yeah, it's
I work with
the
because I have
movement.
my knowledge of.
Yeah, you do have like a culture and like kind of
Yes.
yeah, how close it's like feasible.
Yeah. Yes.
It's just not many people do this. No, not even in Asia.
I
I
agree.
think she's looking at a few programs in Taiwan, but they're usually all Chinese. She wants to find like English programs.
Actually, because I'm at a point in the pattern where I need to pay attention.
I can't remember who else we talked about, but yeah, she wrote to me about it. I think I gave her some names of people that I could think of. But
Yeah, she's talked to
Put that on
myself.
a piece of paper and
I think
be
so.
distracted and distracting.
Yeah, but I think my supervisor in Taiwan was like, you just a little more crazy to stay here.